This is video 2 for starting an ecotherapy practice, a course sponsored by the Mindful Ecotherapy Center. In video 2, we're going to be talking about insurance panels, HMOs, and EAPs. If you're just starting out in private practice, you want as many revenue streams as possible. And although insurance panels, HMOs, and EAPs offer far below the fair market value for therapy services, they are a source of revenue. So if you decide to pursue that, we'll be talking about that in this video. The first thing you're going to need in order to be able to apply to insurance panels is something called a National Provider Identifier, or an NPI number. A National Provider Identifier, or an NPI, is a unique 10-digit identification number issued to healthcare providers in the United States by the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, otherwise known as CMS. Think of it as a Social Security number for therapists. Although it's not a Social Security number, what it is it's a unique identifier to help distinguish you from any other therapist out there in practice, so that when you get paid, that payment goes under your NPI number. The NPI must be used in connection with the electronic transactions identified in HIPAA. In addition, the NPI may also be used in several other ways: by healthcare providers to identify themselves in healthcare transactions identified in HIPAA or on related correspondence, by healthcare providers to identify other healthcare providers in the healthcare transactions or in related correspondence. Now let's unpack all of that and see what that means. You are using your NPI anytime you're submitting something to get billed in private practice, and HIPAA sets out the laws regarding how that number is used. So what that means is any time that you submit a bill, you're going to have your NPI on it to any insurance panel or EAP that you submit a bill to. Next, by healthcare providers to identify themselves in healthcare transactions identified in HIPAA or related correspondence. So in other words, in any official documentation or any official communication that you're making back and forth between insurance panels, EAPs, HMOs, and yourself, you'll always want to include your National Provider Identification number on that correspondence. And most of the forms that they use for that will have a space to put that on there. So it's a good idea to go ahead and memorize your NPI number once you get one, because you'll be using it quite frequently. And then by healthcare providers to identify other healthcare providers in healthcare transactions or in related correspondence. So in other words, if you're communicating with another healthcare provider for any reason, say a doctor, physician, nurse practitioner, any personal care provider that you're communicating with, you want to include your own NPI number on that communication as well. Why else would you use the NPI? You would use it by health plans in their internal provider files to process transactions and communicate with healthcare providers. In other words, your EAPs, your insurance panels, your HMOs are going to use your NPI number in their internal provider files to be able to process the transactions and make sure that you get paid, and to communicate with other healthcare providers that might be interacting with you. So for example, if your patient is referred to you by their doctor, then the doctor is going to include their NPI number on your correspondence, and you include your NPI number on their correspondence. And that's so that all the billing is straight and we all know which pile the money is coming out of. Next, by health plans to coordinate benefits with other health plans. So, for example, if you're getting referrals from EAPs or for HMOs or from insurance panels, then they will include your NPI number when they refer people to you, so that we know that we're getting the right person sent to the right place. And then finally, by healthcare clearinghouses in their internal files to create and process standard transactions and to communicate with healthcare providers and health plans. If you're using a clearinghouse, and we're going to be talking about a major clearinghouse called CAQH here in a moment, you will be using that NPI number in your own personal NPI number in all of the clearinghouses. What a clearinghouse is just kind of a third party who facilitates communication among all these various different agencies. It might sound confusing right now, but when we get to the part of CAQH later on in the presentation, we'll go over that in more detail, and it'll make more sense then. More times when you would use an NPI number. By electronic patient record systems to identify treating healthcare providers in patient medical records. In other words, software, medical software, will use that NPI number to be able to locate you easily. By the Department of Health and Human Services to cross-reference healthcare providers in fraud and abuse files and other program integrity files. the Department of Health and Human Services will have access to your NPI number and be able to identify who you are by that. And they do that in case of needing to cross-reference healthcare providers if there's a fraud or abuse case that comes up against you. And then finally, for any other lawful activity requiring individual identification. Once again, the NPI number is just like a social security number for therapists, or more correctly, just to say it's an identifying number for therapists. Yours is unique. There might be more than one therapist named John Smith, for example, but there won't be more than one therapist with the same NPI number. So that's just a way that CMS uses to help to be able to identify you more easily. So what does that mean in the real world? Your NPI number will be used mostly on super bills, the form known as the CMS 1500 or the HCFA 1500. That is just a generic bill that is used for most EAP billing and invoices as your unique identifying number. So when you're submitting bills to insurance companies to get paid, you'll use that national provider number to be able to get paid so they can identify who they're sending the checks to. And when filling out billing forms, this number will identify you to the insurance company or the EAP. So any other billing form other than the CMS 1500 or the super bill, you would also use that number on that. And you can have a group number for an NPI or an individual number for an NPI. And in most practical cases, there is an NPI number for the agency and then a separate number for each individual practicing in that agency. The NPI number for the group identifies the agency, and then the NPI number for the individual, of course, would identify the individual. If you don't already have an NPI number, it doesn't cost anything to get one. You can go ahead and apply for one anytime you want. And here is the NPI number. This is accurate as of this recording. However, the government loves to change things. So if you can't find it from this link, then you might just do a Google search for how to apply for an NPI number. So if you want to pause the video and write that number, write this link down, go ahead and do that now. Let's go ahead and define some terms before we go any further. First off, an insurance panel. You probably have an insurance policy yourself, health insurance or any other type of insurance. Those are paid for by premiums from the customer. And then when you have a claim filed against it, then the insurance panel pays the claim. An employee assistance program, on the other hand, is paid for by businesses who subscribe to services. So you might work for a company that has an employee assistance program, and they pay a portion of the fee to the company, to the EAP, in order to provide healthcare services for you. Now, that doesn't mean that you won't have to pay anything for it. You might have to pay something for it as well. But in general, the bulk of the premiums for an EAP are paid for by the business or by the employer. And then finally, health maintenance organizations, or HMOs, that's a subscriber service where consumers pay a monthly fee or a yearly fee to the health maintenance organization and then get services based on that subscription fee. Advantages of being on an insurance panel is, number one, you get a listing on their website, and number two, referrals from their customers are also referrals from the website itself. So if someone has a certain type of insurance, say Blue Cross Blue Shield, which is one of the most predominant ones in the United States, then they would go to the Blue Cross Blue Shield website and search out a provider in their area. And if you happen to be in their area, then they might click on you and schedule an appointment. Disadvantages to insurance companies: can deny any claim payment for any reason. They don't have to give you a reason, as a matter of fact. They can just deny the claim for no reason at all. Sometimes they don't pay claims even that they pre-authorized. So what that means is you get a referral from an insurance panel's website. They will send you this person, and then that's pre-authorized. In other words, that person, the panel is sending you the patient based off of their website because you're on their panel. But then sometimes they won't pay you even though they referred the client to you. And then the other one is client confidentiality. What that means is if you're seeing a patient, the insurance company has a right to their diagnosis, what you're doing to treat them, various different ways that you're treating them. Sometimes insurance panels even try to decide what type of services you can provide. In other words, you might think a patient needs dialectical behavioral therapy for borderline personality disorder. And the insurance company might look at that and say, well, no, there's no need for that, so we're going to deny that claim. So the insurance company is making the final decision on the person's health care rather than the therapists themselves. And more disadvantages of insurance panels. There's going to be a quite extensive list of disadvantages on the insurance panel, so in the interest of being as honest as possible, we're going to go over all of those. Again, we've already talked about the fact that insurance panels can deny claim payment for any reason. And sometimes they don't pay claims that they pre-authorized. Client confidentiality, we already discussed. Most insurance companies require a diagnosis in order to pay for treatment. And unless this has changed, I haven't taken insurance in a while for many of the reasons listed here. But there used to be situations where an insurance panel would refer you a patient, and then they would expect you to give them a diagnosis on the first session. And sometimes, I'm sure you know, diagnosis is an ongoing process. You can't just have a diagnosis right after the first session. So if you're submitting a bill, it's hard to know for sure what the diagnosis is. You can have a preliminary diagnosis, but it's not necessarily going to be accurate as you work with the patient over longer periods of time. And of course, the diagnosis becomes a part of your permanent medical or behavioral health history. So what does that mean? For example, I just found this out recently from a client of mine. Their goal was to go to school to become a pilot, to get their pilot's license and become a commercial pilot. They had a diagnosis of bipolar disorder. And I didn't know this at the time, but you cannot get a pilot's license if you have a diagnosis of bipolar disorder. So the diagnosis can bar you from employment, whether or not it's right, whether or not it's discriminatory. Certain diagnoses can prevent you from doing certain things. So if an insurance company or an insurance panel has that diagnosis, then it's part of their permanent medical history. Another example comes up quite often is substance use history or substance abuse history. If you have that diagnosis and your insurance panel has a record of that on your insurance, then that can be used in the future to bar employment to you, that sort of thing. Or it can come up quite often in custody hearings where one parent is trying to get custody of a child over another parent, and then the history of substance abuse comes up and that gets brought up in court. So all of these things are considerations when you're considering taking insurance. And then finally, deductibles and copayments for mental health services are often very high. When they do pay, then the copay that the client has is often going to be very high, or the deductible is going to be very high. And one of the things that most therapists need to be aware of is the January to February fall off. And what that means is when that deductible rolls over at the beginning of January. So say, for example, your patient has $1,000 deductible on their insurance policy. They're getting behavioral health treatment services from you. And then once they get that deductible met, then the insurance pays for the rest of the sessions. So they're paying off on that deductible. And then it gets to be December 31st. What happens at December 31st is that deductible rolls over again. So they have to pay another $1,000 out of their own pocket before the insurance will start paying for sessions again. So if you're a therapist in private practice and you're relying primarily on insurance, be aware that come January or February, when all those deductibles start rolling over, people are going to start dropping out because they don't have the money to pay out of pocket for that deductible anymore. Continuing on with more disadvantages from insurance panels. Some services may not be covered. So one of the examples I used earlier, one of my specialties is borderline personality disorder. The treatment for that is often long-term, 2 years or more, and intensive, meaning more than one session a week, at least one group session and one individual session per week, and sometimes more. When you're trying to do that type of service, insurance is going to look at it and go, nope, we're not going to pay for that. Usually it's between 5 and 12 sessions that are authorized. So anything further than that, some of those services are not going to be covered. Insurance adjusters often make treatment decisions based on the definition of medical necessity. And that's their definition of medical necessity and not the therapist. So if you as the therapist are saying this person needs treatment X for their diagnosis, the insurance panel can look at that and say, no, we're not going to pay that because we don't think it's medically necessary for them to get that treatment, even though they're sitting in an office somewhere remotely removed from where you are. They're making medical decisions on patients just based off of the paperwork that you're sending them. They're not in the room with that person to determine what that person needs. they're still the ones that make the final decision on what's medically necessary or not. So this means that in most cases, an insurance claims manager who's never met your patients face-to-face is making medical decisions on their health care. And then finally, insurance companies usually offer a limited number of sessions, usually between 5 and 12. Most of the time, it was between 5 and 10 when I was in practice. It might have changed, but given the nature of healthcare in the United States, I would assume if I'm going into this that I'm only going to get between 5 and 12 sessions authorized. More disadvantages for insurance panels. Reimbursement rates are generally about half of fair market value. So when I retired from actually actively seeing patients, my going rate was $150 per hour. And that was not particularly high. That was just pretty much the fair market value for any therapist with my experience and my credentials. However, insurance companies were paying between $60 and $75 per hour for someone with my experience and my credentials. So be aware that insurance companies are only going to pay you half of what you're really worth. So if you do decide to take insurance, that's going to be a factor in your decision. And I, as a marriage and family therapist, found that marriage and relationship counseling is rarely covered unless one or both partners has a diagnosable dysfunction in addition to marital problems. And the problem there is there's pressure on the therapist to come up with some sort of Axis 1 or Axis 2 diagnosis so that they can get paid by the insurance companies, whether or not the person actually has one. Now, I'm not saying that that is something you should do. I'm not saying that you should load up diagnoses on your patients so you can get paid from the insurance company. What I'm saying is that this creates a natural situation, whether at the conscious or at the unconscious level, that the therapist is going to look for more diagnoses to support being able to get paid by the insurance company. If you get your insurance through your employer and they pay a portion of the cost, then your employer also has a legal right to check into your records. So, for example, if you're on an EAP, then the EAP is a third party that has access to your medical records. And in some cases, if the insurance is paid by the employer, then the employer can request to see your records as well. So bear that in mind if you decide to take insurance panels. Insurance companies usually require reports of diagnosis and treatment prior to payment. This means that they sometimes ask you to speculate on a diagnosis without having actually met the patient in order to obtain pre-authorization. So pre-authorization is just saying that they're going to guarantee that if you see this patient for at least one session, that they're going to pay for it. So the way this works is that a patient who has the insurance that you take goes to their website and finds your name, and then they click and send a request to their insurance company that they would like to see you. The insurance company will want to pre-authorize that appointment, meaning that they will guarantee the payment for that pre-authorization session for you. But to get pre-authorized, they have to have some sort of preliminary diagnosis. This is why the person is seeing you in the first place. The problem with that is you haven't seen the person yet. So how do you know what their diagnosis is? So in that situation, it's getting into an ethically gray area that in order to get a pre-authorization, they will request a diagnosis that you'll have to speculate on before you can actually see the patient. This also means that your patients have to have a clinical diagnosis acceptable to the insurance company before they'll pay the claim. So it has to be something that the insurance company decides is medically necessary before they will pay their pre-authorized claim. Further disadvantages. I hope you're seeing a pattern here with insurance panels. Some companies will not allow you to seek reimbursement from your patients if they deny the claim. In other words, say you've been seeing this patient for several sessions now. You send in the bill, and then the insurance company denies all those sessions. And this can be a tricky area because insurance companies routinely only send out monthly payments. So theoretically, if you start seeing a patient at the beginning of the month, you might have seen them for 4 or 5 sessions, meaning $400 or $500 at fair market value minimum. And then the end of that month, you get the payment notification for the next month, and it says, well, we didn't authorize this patient, so we're not going to pay for any of those 4 or 5 sessions that you saw the patient for. And then they'll deny the claim. And another problem there is that pre-authorization is not a guarantee of payment. They might pre-authorize a session, but that doesn't mean that they're going to pay for the session. That just means that they're setting the appointment with you. In most cases, the only way to determine for sure if the claim will be paid is to submit a claim for services already rendered and then see if they pay for it. If they deny the claim and they don't allow you to bill the patient, you're just out the money for the services provided. And many insurance panels, if not most, have a clause in there saying that if they deny the claim, you can't then go back and say to the patient, excuse me, your insurance company denied these 4 or 5 sessions last month. They're not going to pay me, so I need to get the money from you. They're not going to do that. They're not going to allow you to do that. Bear that in mind as well when you're starting to look at insurance panels. Whether it's morally or ethically correct or not, insurance companies have a legal right to know everything about the care your patients receive if they're paying for it. So confidentiality is difficult to maintain, and anyone that works for the insurance company can have access to your patient's information. Now, the thing about that is that you're still responsible for your patient's privacy regardless of where the information is going. So if their patient privacy is going to the insurance company and some incompetent employee at the insurance panels leaks that private information, you're on the hook for it. And when behavioral health providers agree to join an insurance panel, they agree to follow all of that company's insurance guidelines, which means that they can request any information they want from a client at any time, within the legal boundaries of HIPAA. And that means that the provider is restricted to the type of therapy used, the amount of sessions, the length of the sessions, and in some cases, the number of people present during the sessions. That can be particularly difficult if you're a marriage and family therapist and you're trying to get billing or trying to get payment out of insurance companies, and they're telling you, well, we're not going to pay for that session because you had too many people in there or you had the wrong person in there. So, for example, suppose I'm seeing a child for therapy. That child is the identified patient. And then later on, I determine that I need to meet with the parents separately from the child for a session just to discuss the case with them. Or the parents request a meeting without the child present to discuss the case with them. I submit the bill for the insurance for the parents, and the insurance company comes back and says, well, the identified patient was the child, so we're not going to pay you to meet with the parents. They're making a medical decision based on what they think is appropriate for payment and deciding who you can see and who you can't see regarding the treatment of the child. So be aware of that as well. Further insurance panel disadvantages. If the therapist believes that one type of therapy is best for the client and the insurance company disagrees, then the client gets the therapy chosen by the insurance company and not by the therapist. Unless, of course, the therapist just refuses and says, this is not the appropriate therapy for this patient, so I'm not going to see them. And we already talked about this briefly, but most deductibles roll over after the first of the year, so there's a great deal of patient attrition in January or March, and January through March, because they're not ready to pay that deductible yet. So if you forget to account for this attrition, and if you have a high volume of practice with insurance companies, that could put you in severe financial difficulties. And be aware also that insurance regulations usually change on January 1st too, so that might mean that you've been seeing this patient for 6 months or so and the insurance has been paying just fine, and then January 1st they make some obscure change to their guidelines that no longer renders that patient available for services or eligible for services. And that means that sometime January or February, you send in another super bill for services that they were paying for in the previous year. And now all of a sudden, they're not paying for them anymore. Insurance companies are notorious for making it extremely difficult to find information on properly filing claims. As a general rule, and this is not an exaggeration, this is actual fact because I kept data on it, I was spending about 2 hours on insurance paperwork for every 1 hour of client contact when I was doing everything myself. So what that meant was that if I saw a patient for 1 hour, I was spending on average 2 hours filing insurance paperwork, being on the phone with the insurance companies, trying to find out if they were going to pay for it or not. Because insurance companies can audit your files at any time. So if you're one of those folks that like to postpone writing your case notes till the end of the month, just be aware that if the insurance company decides to show up, you're going to be in trouble. If your records are not up to their standards, or if they find any problems with the treatment that you provided, you can be required to pay back any reimbursements for services provided. So just because they paid a claim doesn't mean you're going to get to keep that money. They may come back later on and say, well, you didn't fill out this form properly, or you didn't notate this treatment properly, or you didn't notate this diagnosis properly. Then they can take that money back as well. So after hearing all of that, if you'd still like to take insurance, here's the basic procedure. First, you apply to at least one insurance panel that uses CAQH, and we'll talk more detail about what CAQH is in a few moments. This allows you to get a CAQH number, and that's another number that they use to identify you in all of this procedure and process. You get a CAQH number, and then you can use it to apply for more insurance panels. And the advantage of a CAQH number is that you don't have to fill out lengthy credentialing applications over and over again for each panel. It's all handled by CAQH. CAQH is basically a clearinghouse for healthcare provider information. If you've ever applied to any insurance panels, you probably are quite familiar with 30 or 40-page credentialing applications. And then they'll request your transcripts, your licenses, reports from your license board, various different things. And then no two insurance companies request the same thing, but they all have very lengthy 30, 40-page applications. So what CAQH does is takes into consideration everything that most insurance panels request. And then you fill out all that information and put it in CAQH. And then they give you a number. So if an insurance panel says that they want more providers in your area, then they will go to CAQH and look and see if you're available. Or if you're trying to get on an insurance panel in a given area, you take your CAQH number and you put that on the application instead of filling out this big lengthy 30, 40-page application. And then they have access to CAQH. They can go in there and you grant them access to look at your profile. And then they can look at all of that information. And it saves you from having to do all those applications over and over again. So once you've gone through all of that credentialing process and you've been accepted to an insurance panel, first thing you need to do is create and update your provider profile on their website. Anytime you're on an insurance panel, they will give you a profile on the website, and you need to update all of your advertising materials on that website to let your patients know which insurances you accept, and also on your own personal websites or your own personal software that you use, and any paperwork. Update all the information to say I'm on this particular insurance panel so that any patient that you have who is interested in seeing you, they know what insurances you carry. Next, unless you're planning on using some sort of person to do all your insurance billing for you, familiarize yourself with the insurance panel's billing procedures and policies, and no two are alike. Most of them do use the super bill or that CMS 1500 that we were talking about earlier, but they all have different procedures for applying and for sending in their bills. And even if you contract with a medical billing agency, it's still a good idea to have a basic understanding of the billing procedure, because if the billing agency makes a mistake, they're not liable for it. You are. They are a third party that you're hiring, so the ultimate responsibility lies with you. So make sure you know what they're doing, even if you're not doing it yourself. In addition to disadvantages to being on insurance panels, there's some caveats before you even consider being on an insurance panel. A lot of them aren't taking new providers, especially in urban areas. The market is glutted in some areas, and they're just not looking for new providers. And a lot of insurance panels require 3 to 5 years postgraduate experience before they'll accept your application. Some require 3 to 5 years post-licensure experience before they'll accept your application. So that means even if you've graduated and had your license, they still are going to require you to have 3 to 5 years of post-licensure experience. And even if you get approved, that's not a guarantee that they're going to refer people to you. Usually they don't refer people to you unless you have a specialty that they have a great need for. What happens instead is that people with that particular insurance will go to the insurance website and find people in their area, and hopefully you'll match up with a client. And then you still have to market yourself with referral sources. So, for example, hospitals, medical clinics, childcare centers, substance abuse treatment centers, schools, any place that might be willing to refer patients to you, you still need to go market to them so that they will know that you take this particular insurance. Now let's talk about employee assistance programs, or EAPs. Many medium to large businesses offer EAP services to employees, and companies pay the EAPs to contract for behavioral health and other health services. So, for example, if I want to offer substance abuse treatment services for my employees, then I would contract with an EAP and pay them X number of dollars per month per employee to provide basic behavioral health care services for my employees. And usually the services are free to employees in that case. So if you're considering EAPs, let's go over some advantages and disadvantages. The advantages are, first, the services are usually free to employees, which means that the employees will be more likely to show up. Patients are pre-approved, so you'll know that you're getting paid. If an EAP sends you a patient, then you know for sure that they're going to pay you for at least the number of sessions that they authorized. They usually just send in an invoice once a month. In other words, you say, I saw this patient for X number of sessions this month, and then the EAP will say, okay, here's your agreed upon rate for seeing that patient for that many sessions. It means lower medical costs for the employees because the employer is paying for it. It also means reduced turnover and reduced absenteeism for employers. So, for example, if I have an employee that has a substance abuse problem, and then they're getting treated for it, then they're not going to be, getting fired, or they're not going to be late to work, that sort of thing, because the treatment is helping them to overcome those problems. And of course, all of that leads to higher employee productivity. Some disadvantages of employee assistance programs. Number one is that it's difficult to get on an EAP panel unless you're already established. And that goes back to that 3 to 5 years of post-licensure experience that most EAPs are looking for. And there is a thing called a Certified Employee Assistance Professional, CEAP. A lot of EAPs won't take you unless you have that certification or something similar to that. And again, the same problem with insurance panels is that provider saturation in some areas, especially in urban areas. So if you live in a major city, then the EAP panels are already going to be full of all the providers that they're going to need. Employee assistance programs have been criticized for their lack of impartiality in cases where an employee seeks assistance due to work-related issues. If I'm being sent to a therapist because I have a substance abuse issue, for example, and that's impacting my job performance, then my employer is going to want to know how I'm progressing. And if I'm not progressing as well as my employer thinks that I should, then I could possibly be fired or could possibly be subject to disciplinary action at work. So what that does is put some pressure on the therapist to either exaggerate the progress that the patient is making or to report accurate information that may be detrimental to the patient. So in either case, that's a very gray area ethically. And then finally, programs where EAP providers are employed by the same company as the program participants are particularly criticized as being another arm of company management. So what does that mean? Some companies establish their own EAPs. Some of the larger corporations, they just create an EAP in-house. In other words, they hire a bunch of behavioral health professionals to provide services to their employees. So if I'm an EAP therapist at, say, Acme Corporation, and then I'm seeing an employee of Acme Corporation, if my employer doesn't think that I'm doing the treatment correctly, or if I'm not doing the treatment well enough, then my job is in danger as well as the employee's job is in danger. So you can see how that could spark all sorts of conflict of interest problems. And here's a big ethical disadvantage. One of the main reasons I didn't take EAPs. If your patients are referred by an EAP through their place of employment, most EAP provider contracts state that the therapist's primary responsibility is to the EAP and not to the patient or client. So this puts the therapist in an ethical quandary. Therapist's primary duty should be to the patient or the client and not to the employer. And you can see where information that could be beneficial to the client but detrimental to the EAP or detrimental to the company that hired the EAP could put you in a conflict of interest situation. Okay, we've been over all the advantages and disadvantages of EAPs. If you're still interested in being on an EAP, first off, many EAPs use CAQH as well. So if you have a CAQH account, then you can refer the EAPs to that and give them access to your application data, and they can look at that, and then you don't have to fill out the 30, 40-page application. It's relatively painless in their application procedure for EAPs as opposed to insurance panels, which can be a little more lengthy and involved. But the same caveats apply. Usually requires 3 to 5 years of post-grad experience, and in some cases 3 to 5 years post-licensure experience. And again, if the market is saturated in your area, there's no way you're going to get on an EAP because they already have all the providers that they want. And another thing to be aware of is EAPs tend to pay even lower than insurance panels in some cases. So it could be less than half of the fair market value that therapists usually get paid. Final thing we're going to talk about here is health maintenance organizations, or HMOs. An HMO is an organization that provides managed care for health insurance, self-funded healthcare benefit plans, individuals, and acts as a liaison with healthcare providers, hospitals, doctors, etc., on a prepaid basis. Customers subscribe and pay a regular fee, usually a monthly fee. So this is something that you sign up for and say, I would like to join an HMO, and then you pay a regular monthly fee, and then they say, well, you're granted this much health care for this period, for this time period. HMOs originally started out because they believed that it would be cost effective. If you're paying a monthly fee and you have a bunch of people paying a monthly fee, then there should be cost savings because everybody's kind of supporting the amount of health care that you need. It's sort of like a mini insurance policy. But research has shown that private HMO plans don't achieve any significant cost savings over non-HMO plans. So a lot of people are backing off of the HMOs nowadays. And although out-of-pocket costs are reduced for consumers with HMO models, the plans don't affect the total expenditures and payments by the insurers. And part of the reason for that is that the amount of services being provided by the HMOs doesn't match up to what you could get with other models like insurance or EAPs. Some have asserted that HMOs, especially those that are run for profit, actually increase administrative costs and tend to cherry-pick healthier patients. And that generally happens anytime you have a third party involved, that you've got another layer of people that have to be paid, and the HMO employees have to be paid there. So that's that third layer, and that money's got to come from somewhere. So the money comes from increasing administrative costs. Cherry picking of healthier patients means that HMOs, you have to apply to be on an HMO. You have to have a physical exam, a mental health exam in some cases, and then they're going to look at all your data and decide whether or not they're going to allow you to join their HMO. And so they tend to cherry pick people who don't need as much healthcare service. HMOs are usually a subdivision of insurance companies. So if you want further information on joining or getting to be a provider on an HMO, you need to contact a company that provides such services. We've got a few of them listed here. This list is not all-inclusive. This is just an idea to get you started. Aetna, Blue Cross, Blue Shield, Cigna, Kaiser Permanente, Humana, HealthNet, United Health Group, and WellPoint all have HMOs. Earlier, we talked about CAQH, and just to refresh your memory, what that is a clearinghouse for healthcare provider information. What they do is they take all your information, all your credentials, all your transcripts, all of the experience and certifications that you've had, and all the education that you've had, and they create a file on you. And that file contains most of the information that most insurance companies, EAPs, and HMOs would want to see before they would allow you to be on their panel. So it creates that account with all that information. And then anytime you want to get on an insurance panel or a HMO or an EAP, then you give them your CAQH account number, and they go in and look at your application instead of you having to fill out an application every time you want to be on an insurance panel. And those applications, as we said, are quite lengthy, 30, 40, sometimes 50, 60 pages long. So let's talk about the mission statement and the vision. This comes directly from the CAQH website. Their mission statement is to be the catalyst for industry collaboration on initiatives that simplify healthcare administration for health plans and providers, resulting in a better care experience for patients and caregivers. In other words, this kind of facilitates the process of insurance panels, EAPs, and HMOs getting in contact with and finding the best healthcare providers for their panels. The vision of CAQH is a healthcare system in which administrative processes are efficient, predictable, and easily understood by patients, caregivers, and providers. In this system, administrative and clinical data are integrated to effectively support the delivery of care. Basically, what that means is they simplify and standardize the processes so that everyone can understand it a little bit easier, and then you're not reinventing the wheel every time you try to do something. So what is the Coalition for Affordable Quality Healthcare? First off, it's a nonprofit alliance of health plans and trade associations for simplifying healthcare administration through industry initiatives that 1. Promote quality interactions between plans, providers, and other stakeholders. In other words, they help to facilitate that communication between insurance panels or other types of healthcare plans and providers who are seeking to join those panels, and other stakeholders who might be involved, like EAPs, HMOs, patients, customers, that sort of thing. Next is to reduce the cost and frustrations associated with healthcare administration, and that includes time as well as financial cost. As a therapist, that's what you're selling. You're selling your time. So any time that you're not spending in front of a patient, talking to a patient, is money that is going out the window. So if you're spending a lot of time filling out lengthy insurance panel applications over and over again, then that's money. So one way that CAQH reduces cost is by just standardizing the application process. You create one application once, and then all the insurance panels that take CAQH can go in and look at it and get the information that way. Then, of course, it facilitates administrative healthcare information exchange by creating a standardized form and way of doing it, and by creating a central access point for all these EAPs, insurance panels, to be able to go to get information on healthcare providers. Then that improves the way that this information is exchanged. And then finally, encourage administrative and clinical data integration. The clinical side and the administrative side are two separate issues. And as I mentioned earlier, when I was doing my own insurance billing, I was spending 2 hours of my very valuable time on insurance paperwork for every 1 hour that I was spending with a patient. So anything that can streamline the process, to standardize the process, centralize the process, is going to integrate clinical data and administrative data. When I first started in private practice, the Coalition for Affordable Quality Healthcare was a new thing, and it was an exciting new idea for anybody who had filled out a bunch of insurance paperwork. And so physicians and other healthcare providers are now using this industry standard for provider data collection. It has become a well-respected industry standard. It's basically a clearinghouse for provider credentialing, as we already said, and by creating a CAQH account and submitting your credentials, they're all stored in a central location in the CAQH database. So all the insurance panels, all the EAPs can access your data easily, and you only have to submit your credentials to one location instead of to every insurance panel and every EAP and having to fill out all those lengthy applications over and over again. So how do you become a member of CAQH? How do you get an account? First thing you have to do is to apply to an insurance company or an EAP that uses CAQH. And most of the major ones do use CAQH, so that shouldn't be too difficult. Now, you do have to fill out the big, long, lengthy form that the insurance panel is requiring you to do. But once you do that, you submit it to the company. And then they will ask CAQH to create an account for you. And that will create your CAQH account. And then when that happens, you will get a CAQH number. And then you can create your account when you have that number. You go in and enter the number on their website, and then you create an account. And once your account is created, you can add insurance panels and EAPs, etc., to your account. You'll have to upload a lot of information to your account just one time to have it all centrally located. And it might include your college transcripts, copies of your licenses, copies of any of your certifications, all of that information. And once it's there, then all the insurance panels have access to it. So once you've done that, then you're pretty much done. Now, you do have to update it every year or so to make sure that the information is still accurate. But the majority of the information has already been entered, so it's already there at the location. One of the things we haven't talked about yet, and this kind of goes hand in hand with applying to insurance panels, EAPs, and HMOs, is that no insurance company is going to take you unless you have liability or malpractice insurance. And the reason that you have that is because it covers you in case you're sued for malpractice. The recommended minimum is $2 million coverage for individual are $5 million aggregate. So what's the difference between individual and aggregate? Individual means that the amount of money that they will pay out per settlement. Aggregate means the amount of money that they will pay out for the calendar year for the policy. So for example, suppose someone sues you for $2 million. Then if your liability insurance covers that, then they will pay out the $2 million for that person. Now suppose later on in the same year, another person sues you for $2 million. Then they will pay that if they believe it's warranted and authorized and covered by your policy. And that goes on until they reach the $5 million aggregate for the year. $5 million, the aggregate amount is the amount that is paid out maximum for the entire calendar year. So what that means is that individual covers your personal liability per incident, and aggregate covers the total number of incidents per term of the policy. And again, be aware that no insurance or EAP panel will accept you if you don't have liability insurance. In addition to a regular malpractice policy, you also need a slip and fall policy, and that should cover you for everything your liability insurance doesn't. So slips, falls, accidents, acts of God. If you're renting office space, most landlords are going to require this anyway. So the reason for that is if someone comes to see you in your office and they slip and fall outside the door and hurt themselves, then you're covered. They're not, if they sue you because the floor was slippery or the landing was slippery, you're covered with that. There are some special considerations for liability insurance with ecotherapy. If you're going in to talk to your insurance agent, you need to make sure that the slip and fall policy or the liability insurance that you're using will cover outdoor therapy. And that's probably going to be specific to the places that you're doing outdoor therapy. If you're doing mountain climbing or whitewater rafting or wrestling grizzly bears or anything along those lines where there's a likelihood of danger, then that's obviously going to increase your insurance liability. So make sure that you understand what your policy covers and what it doesn't cover. And then the final thing we're going to talk about in this hour is the professional organizations that you can join. One of the reasons we mentioned this while we're talking about insurance and liability and all of that is that professional organizations usually offer discounts on liability and malpractice insurance if you're a member of the organization. And that's good for the organization and that's good for the insurance company because the insurance company knows that you're operating under some ethical code and you have some ethical responsibility to minimize the likelihood of malpractice. Here are some of the major ones, and I'm not going over the whole list. They're not all inclusive, but these are just examples of some professional organizations. The first is what I'm a member of as of this recording, the American Association of Marriage and Family Therapists, AAMFT. Another one is the American Psychological Association, the APA, the National Association of Alcohol and Drug Abuse Counselors, or NADAC, the National Association of Social Workers, National Board for Certified Counselors, and the Licensed Professional Counselors Association. If you're not a member of one of those already, you've probably heard of them. Now let's talk about the advantages and disadvantages of joining professional organizations. The advantages of any professional organization are first networking. You get to meet others in the field for exchange of ideas and referrals and peer supervision, and just being able to have some support in your practice. Next is education, keeping informed by subscribing to newsletters of your professional organization, magazines and journals, and also CEU opportunities, or it's no longer called CEUs, now we're calling them CEs, continuing education opportunities, basically. Just for example, I'm also a member of the American Play Therapy Association, and they have an educational arm that is specific to play therapy. So by being subscribed to their newsletters, their magazines, and their journals, and also their continuing education opportunities, I'm able to get education specific to play therapy. And then the intrinsic value, which is peer support, feeling of being a part of something bigger. You're able to support each other. You're all together and meeting at conferences and networking and feeling the opportunities for being supported and supporting each other. And then one of the financial considerations is you get discounts on seminars, continuing education materials, and conferences. Now, some disadvantages to professional organizations. Sometimes the membership fees can be expensive. I'm a member of the AAMFT right now, and that is one of the most expensive professional organizations out there. So it can be taxing, especially if you're not generating a lot of income as you're starting out, to pay those fees. And the membership is often restricted by education, by licensure, etc. Marriage and family therapists, for example, by education, that is more inclusive of those who are familiar with the principles of marriage and family therapy. And one of the reasons for that is that the ethical code for a marriage and family therapist, for example, is going to be specific to marriage and family therapy. If you were educated in some other program other than marriage and family therapy, then you're going to not be as educated in what the specifics of those educational ethical codes are about. Likewise with any other organization, for example, the American Psychological Association. If your licensure is not specific to that and you're a member of that organization, your ethical code may or may not have been supported by your educational experience, if that makes sense. And when you join the code, you're bound by that organization's ethical code, which may conflict with state law or the ethical codes of other organizations. Just to give you an example, I'm a member of 2 or 3 professional organizations, APA, American Play Therapy Association, American Association of Marriage and Family Therapy. As of this recording, I'm a member of those organizations. I am bound by the ethical codes of those organizations. When I lived in South Carolina and was licensed as a therapist in South Carolina, sometimes the legal requirements of South Carolina were at odds with the ethical codes that I abide by. One of the examples I would use quite a bit is ethical codes generally require you to respect the privacy of your patients, and that includes whether the patient is a child or an adult. So your child might tell you something in confidence that the parent is going to want to know about. And ethically, you should respect the child's privacy unless the child is saying something that's going to put them in danger. However, in South Carolina, when I was practicing there, at the time, the law was that the parent had a right to anything in the child's file at any time. Number one, that's a violation of my ethical code. If a parent came to me and said, please tell me what's in my child's file, I want to see all of my child's records, then the child might have told me something that was told in confidence, and sharing that with the parent might betray that parent's confidence. For example, I worked a lot with sexually abused children, and if I'm going to go tell the parent who abused them sexually that the child told me that they abused them sexually, then there is going to be some severe consequences for that. So the state's ethical code and the state's legal requirements and the personal ethical codes were in conflict in that case. So if you join a professional organization that requires an ethical code, be aware that there could be some legal conflicts there. And another disadvantage, or it could be an advantage, depends on how you look at it. You may be asked or required to serve on committees or as an officer for the organization, which takes a lot of time and offers no compensation. I happen to thrive on that. I was a member of several different committees for some of the organizations that I've served with in the past, but some people consider that a disadvantage if they have a lot of clients and they don't have a lot of free time for that sort of thing. That concludes video 2, and video 3 will be discussing advertising and marketing your ecotherapy practice.